This week, we'll be looking at Kant's refutation of idealism. Kant's refutation has great philosophical significance, even though it has relatively little historical significance. Kant's refutation was not in the original 1781 edition of the Critique. Kant inserted it in the 1787 edition in the middle of another chapter, the Postulates, in which Kant discusses the categories of modality, necessity, actuality, and possibility. And indeed, Kant's refutation plays no role whatsoever in answering the question, how is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? And it does nothing to advance Kant's argument for transcendental idealism. So in these ways, Kant's refutation has little historical or systematic significance within the context of the Critique. But nevertheless, Kant's refutation has been immensely philosophically significant. Indeed, it's one of the most philosophically significant passages of the Critique, and it's drawn some of the most attention by readers of the Critique. Why is this? Kant's refutation provides an argument against external world skepticism. And this argument is thought either to be successful, or if it's not itself successful, it's thought to provide a model for successful arguments against external world skepticism. Arguments that follow this model are called transcendental arguments. So Kant identifies his skeptical opponent as an external world skeptic in the first paragraph of the Refutation of Idealism at B274. He does this by distinguishing Descartes' idealism from Berkeley's idealism. He writes, "Idealism is the theory that declares the existence of objects in space outside us to be either merely doubtful and indemonstrable, or else false and impossible." Kant explains that the former is the problematic idealism of Descartes, who declares only one empirical assertion, namely I am, to be indubitable, and the latter is the dogmatic idealism of Berkeley, who declares space, together with all the things to which it is attached, as an inseparable condition, to be something that is impossible in itself, and who therefore also declares things in space to be merely imaginary. Now Kant claims that the ground for Berkeleyan idealism is undercut in the transcendental aesthetic. And so for this reason, Kant's refutation of idealism takes on Descartes' problematic idealism. Now, of course, Descartes doesn't deny that there is an external world. To the contrary, Descartes provides a proof of the external world in his sixth meditation. But what Kant aims to oppose here is Descartes' skeptical method. In the first meditation, Descartes endeavors to show what can be doubted. He argues, first, since the senses are occasionally unreliable, the contents of one's sense experience can be doubted. Next, Descartes argues that since veridical and illusory sensory experiences are subjectively indistinguishable, we have reason to doubt the existence of the entire external world, and indeed, we have reason to doubt the reality of the past. Descartes then argues that since we don't know whether our minds were created by an all-powerful God, and indeed, since we don't know God's nature, or whether our minds were brought about by chance, we have reason to doubt even the general truths of mathematics and logic. Yet in the second meditation, Descartes argues that the proposition I am cannot be doubted, so long as the proposition is entertained. So at this point in meditation 2, Descartes supposes that my awareness of my own mental states can't be wrong, yet my experience of the external world can be wrong. So in this sense, Descartes privileges inner experience over outer experience. Descartes thinks that inner experience is indubitable, while outer experience is doubtable. This is the position that Kant seeks to oppose in his refutation of idealism. He aims to show against Descartes that inner experience is possible only under the presupposition of outer experience. So in other words, Kant thinks that Descartes cannot be in the position that he takes himself to be in meditation 2. Kant aims to show that it's impossible to doubt the existence of the external world, so long as one is aware of one's own existence. As Kant puts the thesis, the mere but empirically determined consciousness of my own existence proves the existence of objects in space outside me. The first premise in Kant's proof of this thesis is I am conscious of my existence as determined in time. So is this a premise that Descartes does accept or would accept in meditation 2? Of course, Descartes accepts that I'm aware of my own existence. But am I aware of my own existence in time? Now, of course, Kant's aesthetic has argued that time is the form of inner sense. So perhaps, while Descartes himself doesn't claim that I'm aware of my own existence as determined in time, Kant can argue that insofar as one is aware of one's own existence, one must be aware of one's own existence as determined in time. A potential problem, though, is that Descartes denies the reality of the past. So Kant would beg the question against Descartes if his premise were that my memories have a veridical time determination. For example, I seem to remember that yesterday I ate dinner and then I ate ice cream. Descartes' skeptical argument in the first meditation is that because memories are subjectively indistinguishable from dreams, I can't be sure that these memories are veridical. That is, I can't be sure that, in fact, I had dinner yesterday and then I had ice cream. So if Kant's premise is assuming that the time sequence of my memories is veridical, he would beg the question against the Cartesian skeptic. So a more charitable interpretation of Kant's first premise wouldn't commit him to the veridicality of my memories, but merely to the temporal ordering of my memories themselves. In other words, Kant's premise is that it seems to me that my inner experience is time determined. That is, I seem to remember eating dinner yesterday and then having ice cream. So on this interpretation, Kant's first premise, that I am conscious of my existence as determined in time, only commits Kant to the claim that my inner experience presents itself as temporally ordered, or that my inner experience seems to have a temporal ordering, not that this temporal ordering is an accurate representation of anything outside of my inner experience. This is a premise that the Cartesian skeptic of Meditation 1 would accept. The second premise in Kant's refutation is all time determination presupposes something persistent in perception. Now, this is surely meant to be a result from the first analogy, but it's worth considering exactly what result from the first analogy Kant intends to cite here. If you recall from last week, Kant offers a variety of arguments for the persistence of substance in the first analogy. The first argument aimed to show that we can distinguish succession from simultaneity only on the basis of representing a substance persisting through change. So is Kant assuming that I can distinguish simultaneity from succession in my inner experience, but that I can draw this distinction only if I represent a substance in my outer experience? Alternatively, Kant argued in the first analogy that we can represent a temporal duration only by representing the persistence of substance. And he argued that we can represent the unity of time only through the representation of a persistent substance. So perhaps Kant's argument in the refutation is that we can represent the duration of an inner experience, or the unity of time in our inner experience, only if we presuppose a substance persisting in outer experience. It's not obvious, though, whether any of these arguments would hook up in the right way with the first premise in Kant's refutation. Kant's first premise, I think, is best interpreted as stating that it seems to us as though our inner experience is temporally ordered. So to hook up with this first premise, the second premise should state that we can be aware of a determinate temporal ordering only by being aware of a persistent substance. So the question to ask yourself is whether the first analogy provides an argument for this premise, that a determinate temporal ordering presupposes a persisting substance. Kant's third premise reads, this persistent thing, however, cannot be something in me, since my own existence in time can first be determined only through this persistent thing. So this is the crucial premise in Kant's argument, for it's this premise that states that the persistent thing that makes it possible for me to be aware of my inner experience as temporal can't be an object in my inner experience itself, so must instead be an object in my outer experience. So what's the reasoning? Why can't the persistent thing be an object in my inner experience? What Kant seems to say in this sentence is that the persistent thing cannot be something in my inner experience because my inner experience in time can first be determined only through a persistent thing. And this would completely beg the question. What Kant is trying to argue in the refutation is that my awareness of my own existence presupposes objects outside of me. So it had better not be a premise in Kant's argument that my awareness of my own existence in time can be determined only through a persistent thing outside of me. I think it's for this reason that Kant wanted to replace this sentence in his refutation with the sentence contained in the footnote. As Kant explains in his preface, Kant sent his manuscript for the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason to the publisher with the sentence, this persistent thing cannot be something in me, since my own existence in time can first be determined only through this persistent thing. But then, after sending his manuscript to the publisher, Kant wanted to edit this sentence, and he asked the publisher to replace the sentence with the sentence that occurs in the footnote. But the publisher had already typeset the Critique of Pure Reason and was unwilling to change the sentence. So instead, Kant added an addendum to his preface, in which he instructed the reader to strike the sentence that appears in the refutation and replace it with the sentence that's included in the footnote. So what Kant wanted his third premise to say was, this persistent thing, however, cannot be an intuition in me, for all grounds of determination of my existence that can be encountered in me are representations, and as such require some persistent thing that is distinct even from them, in relation to which their change, thus my existence in time in which they change, can be determined. Now, this premise doesn't obviously beg the question, since Kant doesn't state that the persistent thing can't be in me, since my awareness of myself presupposes my awareness of things in space outside of me. But what does the third premise say? The first difference is that instead of saying that the persistent thing cannot be something in me, Kant instead says the persistent thing cannot be an intuition in me. But I don't think this is an important difference, since an intuition is just the presentation of a thing to me. So Kant's claim is still that the persistent thing cannot be something that is presented in inner intuition to me. The key difference is Kant's reason. Instead of question-beggingly stating that my awareness of myself presupposes my awareness of things outside of me, Kant instead remarks on the nature of my inner experience. He says that everything I'm aware of in my inner experience are mere representations. To see what Kant means by this, I think it's useful to reflect on qualitative and numerical identity. So as regards the objects of my outer experience, two objects can be qualitatively identical, but numerically distinct. right? There can be two objects that look totally alike, but yet are different objects. And so in the case of outer experience, if we see a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, and then again see a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, we can ask, is the first copy of the Critique of Pure Reason I saw the very same object as the second copy of the Critique of Pure Reason I saw? Or do they just look alike without being numerically identical? So the thought here is that that question makes sense with respect to the objects of my outer experience. With respect to the objects of my outer experience, it makes sense to distinguish qualitative and numerical identity. But does this distinction make sense with respect to my inner experience? So consider a pain, for example. Suppose every time I go on an airplane, I feel a pain on the right side in the back of my neck. Now, suppose I go to the doctor, and I tell the doctor, every time I fly, I feel this pain on the right side in the back of my neck. Now, suppose the doctor asks me, is it the very same pain that you feel? Or is it a variety of pains that all feel the same way? Would this question make any sense? I don't think it would. If I feel a stabbing pain in my neck today and a dull pain in my neck a month from now, I would say that these are different pains because their qualities are different. They feel differently. If, by contrast, I feel a dull pain in the back of my neck today and a dull pain in the back of my neck in a month, I would say these are the same pain precisely because they feel the same. There's no further question whether they merely feel the same or whether they actually are numerically identical. In my inner experience, all there is the representations, as Kant puts it. There's no object in inner experience over and above the representations. In other words, in inner experience, I'm simply aware of qualities. I'm aware of sharp stabbing pains, or dull pains, or throbbing pains, but I'm not aware of something that has the pains. This is in contrast to outer experience, where I'm aware not only of qualities, but also of the objects that bear the qualities. I'm aware not just of bright red, but of bright red apples. So now Kant's argument and the refutation is that because I am aware of my own inner experience as having temporal determinations, even if those temporal determinations are non-veridical. And since I can be aware of temporal determinations only if I'm aware of some persisting thing, and because there are no things in inner sense, but only qualities, it follows that I must be aware of things outside of me. So this is Kant's conclusion in the refutation. The determination of my existence in time is possible only by means of the existence of actual things that I perceive outside myself. Now, how satisfying is this argument against the Cartesian skeptic? Kant acknowledges, in Note 3 on B278, that from the fact that the existence of outer objects is required for the possibility of a determinate consciousness of ourself, it does not follow that every intuitive representation of outer things includes at the same time their existence. For that may well be the mere effect of the imagination, in dreams as well as in delusion. Kant explains that here it has been proved only that inner experience in general is possible through outer experience in general. So what Kant's acknowledging here is that not all of our outer experiences are veridical experiences. We of course have dreams and illusions and hallucinations. But what Kant has proved, he thinks, is that we couldn't have dreams or delusions or hallucinations unless at some point we had a veridical experience of the external world. So in other words, Kant hasn't undercut the first skeptical argument that Descartes gives in the first meditation, but he has undercut the second skeptical argument. Kant hasn't shown that we have reason to trust every one of our sense experiences. So Kant hasn't removed skepticism about individual sense experiences. But what he has removed is global external world skepticism. He's removed the doubt that all of my sense experiences are illusory or hallucinatory. He's argued that I couldn't seem to have a temporally ordered awareness of my own representative states unless at least one of those representative states were the experience of an actually existing external world. So now in your papers, I want you to spell out and evaluate this argument in more detail. Now, as I said at the beginning, much of the philosophical significance of this argument is due to its providing a general model for arguments against external world skepticism. The model is to identify a merely subjective phenomenon and show that this subjective phenomenon presupposes the existence of the external world. The subjective phenomenon that Kant attempts to identify in his refutation is the awareness of my existence as determined in time, or the temporal order of my inner experiences. So if you think Kant's refutation isn't wholly successful against the Cartesian skeptic, it might be worth considering whether you think there are other subjective phenomena that might feature in a transcendental argument that show that there must be an external world.